order on what is today, June 17th at 9 a.m. Usually what we do is we start by introducing ourselves, and we'll let the senators go first.
Well, if we're going by alphabetical order, I think that means me first. So I'm Senator Joe Benning, and I represent the Caledonia District.
Senator Chris Bray, live in Bristol, represent Addison District, which is Addison County, Huntington, and Buell Score.
Good morning, Ginny Long. I live in Williston. I represent Chittenden County in the Senate.
Senator Mark McDonald from Orange County. Good morning.
Representative Trevor Squirrel representing Jericho and Underhill.
Representative Carol Odie representing the far new north end of Burlington and on the House Ways and Means Committee in-house.
Representative Mark Higley from Lowell, and I represent Lowell, J, Westfield, Troy, and Eden.
Representative Seth Bongratz will represent Bennington 4, Arlington, Manchester, Sandgate, and Sunderland.
Okay. First order are the minutes from May 27th, 2021. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Any discussion, any edits? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, we have two bills, two rules on our agenda today. The first one, 21E07, Department of Corrections Earned Good Time, repeal of emergency rule. Speaking, I believe, for Department of Corrections and Coburn, and also Monica Weber. I'll let you decide who's going to start.
I'll start, sir. Thank you very much. My name is Ann Corbin, and I'm the policy manager for the Department of Corrections. Good morning, all, and thank you for hearing our repeal request for this rule. So this emergency earned time rule reinstituted an earned good time program for our Vermont Department of Corrections incarcerated and furloughed individuals. The rule was implemented on January 1st, 2021 for statute. And then 2021 Act 12 amended the enabling statute, and that invalidated this emergency rule. That took place on April 26th, 2021. The adopted earned time rule that we submitted, consistent with 2021 Act 12, that replaced the emergency rule, and that took effect on June 12th, 2021. So the rule's invalid.
Okay, that's the extent of your presentation.
That is, I will invite my
Okay.
colleague Monica Weber to chime in if she would like to add more detail.
Well, thanks, Ann. I'm Monica Weber, Administrative Services Director. I think Ann covered it, and we're happy to answer any questions that people might have. We have two rules in effect right now. We'd like the final adopted rule that this body considered last month to be the one that's officially on the books and have this emergency rule repealed.
Okay. Are there any questions for the committee? Representative Higley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question, and again, I might have mentioned this before, but on the economic impact, it looks like about $80,000 of overtime that was needed to implement this. Am I correct in that?
We did consider that there would be some overtime and or that we would need to hire new staff in order to implement the rule. And we did have to hire a new staff person to manage the sentence computations. We have experienced some overtime in general for a lot of our justice reinvestment work, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute it or have the actual numbers right now.
So again, it's one more full-time employee, correct?
For the sentence computation unit, yes, to manage all of the work related to applying earned time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Senator McDonald?
Thank you. This was a controversial statute when it was amended. And because, for all the obvious reasons. And I believe the last time we had a public hearing, we asked which are the crimes for which good time is not available. And perhaps if we could just list those offenses, that would give some, for the public listening in, would give some assurance that this is not a dangerous or bill.
Yes, sir. I can give you that list right now. Actually, see, that list is murder in violation of 13 VSA 2301. Actually, I'll just list the names: voluntary manslaughter, kidnapping, lewd and lascivious conduct with a child, provided that the offense shall not be considered a disqualifying offense if the offender is under 18 years of age, the child is at least 12 years of age, and the conduct is consensual, sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, and finally, aggravated sexual assault of a child. That's the list.
So just once again, for the record, when we're looking at good time, does these rules apply to offenses that are not against individuals and violent offenses? They are of a different and distinct nature. Is that correct?
Yes, those folks who have been incarcerated for those crimes will not be able to earn earned time. There was some discussion and objection to the use of earned good time, so they're using earned time to refer to this these days. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Someone like to offer a motion on the rule?
So moved.
Senator Bray?
I would move approval of Rule 21E07.
Is there a second?
Second.
Representative Bongatz. Okay, any discussion? All those in favor of 21E07, please say aye.
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 Those opposed? Okay. Rule passes. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Next up is Rule 20P25, Agency of Natural Resources Clean Water Service Provider Rule. We have members of the Department of Environmental Conservation with us today, and a couple other individuals that are here to testify. Of the three members listed on my list for Department of Environmental Conservation, Neil, would I assume correctly that you'll be doing a presentation?
Good morning, Representative Squirrel. Yes, I will lead the presentation. We will probably tag team.
Okay, great. Please proceed.
All right, thank you. Good morning to all members. And as well, I see that you're here and some stakeholders that we've been working with for quite some time. I'm going to provide a quick introduction to this rule and the process we've been through to build the rule out. I will provide one request of the committee in terms of the change that we would seek you to authorize between the version that you had and the version we would like to promulgate. I'll explain that. We'll turn it over to our attorney, Caitlin Ellerman, to give you the architecture of the rule. And then we received from Ledge Councils Dexter, Cooper, and O'Grady some questions that we did provide answers to in our written and submitted testimony. And we'll be happy to chat through any of those. If that run of show, it works, shall I go ahead and go forward?
Seeing no objection.
Thank you, sir. So for you today is the culmination of an awful lot of work. In 2019, the General Assembly passed a bill, the Clean Water Service Provider Act, Act 76. That act did several things, chief amongst which was to identify the final funding necessary, revenue sources necessary to infuse the Clean Water Fund on an annual basis at a sum of $20 or more million a year. The act also established a priority for the department to disperse these dollars towards non-regulatory projects. This means clean water projects that are not required by other permits or rules, such as the 3-acre stormwater or the municipal roads general permit. And the reason that was important and that you did that was that without these non-regulatory projects, we will not be able to meet the clean water goals established by the Lake Champlain Cleanup Plan, the Lake Memphremagog Cleanup Plan, and other smaller ones as well. But the reason we're here today in front of you for rules is that that act also established a new network of what are called clean water service providers. Clean water service providers are organizations that are established by rule, this rule that you're considering today, and that exist in order to receive formula funding from the department and then to work with a set of basin council members who are established as statutory members in the act to make decisions about where to disperse those dollars to achieve the best pollution reduction and local co-benefits. I do want to recognize this is a huge team effort. The folks that are joining me today are part of the team and others at the department, and we worked with a vast number of stakeholders. The process, the stakeholder engagement process around building this rule started very shortly after the act passed in July of 2019, where the department began to educate our stakeholders as to our interpretation of the act, and then learn from the stakeholders their interpretation of the act. And through a series of meetings and then the impaneling of an advisory group that guided the state throughout our process of building this rule, we worked together to establish what we felt were the criteria necessary to identify the clean water service providers. The stakeholders assisted us in developing an RFP, request for proposals. That request for proposals was subjected to public comment and then issued. We have 6 organizations that proposed to serve as clean water service providers, and they are in this rule as the assignees as a result of that request for proposals and the evaluation that we did. So the rule in front of you essentially establishes sort of the parameters of operation of these clean water service providers and their local basin water quality councils. And you can imagine that it's a bit of a complex affair to set the rules of the road for organizations that are essentially receiving straight formula grant funding from the Clean Water Fund, and then operating at a local level to use those dollars to the best possible effect. So essentially moving the state investment into a local organization that is standing up clean water projects. We spent a lot of time in our discussions with stakeholders on matters having to do with conflicts of interest, and I'll explain why. The Act establishes basin water quality councils, which are seated by organizations, members of organizations that are effectively and very well qualified to actually build these water quality projects. And so putting a basin council in charge of dispersing dollars when some of those members may actually be the recipients of those dollars creates a construct where conflict could emerge. We worked through it hard a lot and through very, very many permutations with our stakeholders. And we've arrived at what I believe is a good solution in the rule today. However, after we noticed the final rule for your consideration 3 weeks ago, a couple of our stakeholders noticed that we had prospectively stepped one step too far in terms of creating controls over the prospective conflict of interest. And in so doing, we essentially rendered the system far less efficient. And so in my written testimony to you all, I have provided language that was in the public review draft. And then I've provided language that is in the final draft, and are requesting to the committee that you allow us to restore one clause of language that existed in the public review draft that we had struck from the final that comes to you. I know that's a lot of words to be getting on with. I'm happy to get into more detail about the specific language, but I did file it for your consideration if you've had a chance to see. The stakeholders that are gathered with us today and have requested testimony have been a key part of this all along the way. And they are in agreement with the request we're making of you for a minor modification to the procurement section of the rule. But I don't want to speak for them, and that's why they've requested testimony themselves. So with that, I will pause here for questions. I'm happy to describe in more detail the restored language we seek. And then maybe turn it over to our attorney, Caitlin Ellerman, to talk about the architecture of the rule before we get into Ledge Council's questions. So I'll take a pause there.
All right, so Caitlin?
Sure. Thank you, Representative Squirrel and members of the committee. My name is Caitlin Ellerman, and I am an attorney for the Department of Environmental Conservation, and have been working closely with the team in drafting this rule. I do want to invite Neil, as well as one of our other team members in the meeting this morning, Chris Rotler, to jump in as both of them are extremely well-versed in this proposed rule as well. I did want to give sort of an overview of the structure, architecture of the rule, which you've hopefully had a chance to review, at least in some form, before we get into questions and conversation. And I do want to move fairly quickly, because I do recognize that we have a number of folks in the meeting this morning who would like to speak to the rule, as well as a number of very good questions from Legislative Council to go over. So really, you can certainly benefit just from reviewing the table of contents of the rule, and I'll sort of use that as a guide. We do have the overview, obviously reflecting on the purpose of this rule based on the charge of 10 BSA section 922A, assigning clean water service providers for the purpose of achieving pollution reduction values. We have a definition section, which does include a number of terms that were defined by the Act, as well as a number of others that we attempted our best to tie to existing statutory terms. I would flag, and this will certainly come up in our conversation regarding questions from Legislative Council. The definition of clean water project has been proposed to be slightly amended with regard to projects in the agricultural sector. This is, we do not see this as a substantive change, but to make very clear how those projects will be looked at, and that does tie back to a legislative report that was intended to address the role of both agricultural sector projects in meeting pollution reductions, as well as this clean water service provider model. I believe there was one other term, standard cost, that had been flagged by Legislative Council as a potential additional defined term, as well as the term fiscal sponsor, which appears just once in relation to Basin Water Quality Council members. So we'll flag that as needed in discussion. The rule then goes into the Clean Water Service Provider section, starting with assignment, and as Neil described, the request for proposal process, which actually already took place at the start. You'll see in Appendix A, those service providers are identified along with what we've labeled as the initial term. So that will be the first, generally 5 years. And our proposal is that, assuming that that service continues, the rule wouldn't need to be open. We could sort of maintain that entity in that position. If the identity of the assigned entity were to change, we would need to do the rulemaking to amend the Appendix A assignment. And just to flag, we have addressed the potential for transferring assignment to another entity, renewal, as well as a termination of assignment. And those are referenced in this section, but then go into more detail toward the end of the rule. So the Clean Water Service Provider subchapter marches through a number of aspects of QISP, and we use the term QISP as the Clean Water Service Provider acronym. The operations, fiscal sort of operating procedures, fiscal management. And this section also recognizes that there's significant guidance to come from the secretary that was actually required by Act 76. We have specifically called out the requirements of Act 76 that were intended to be in guidance, as well as a number of other items that were identified during the process of drafting this rule. You'll see toward the end of subchapter 3, the public engagement and records provisions, as well as reporting to the secretary on a quarterly basis and an annual basis. Subchapter 4 addresses technical implementation, beginning with the secretary's allocation of pollution reduction targets to a clean water service provider, including identifying standard costs and design life, pollution reduction and design life methodologies. Section 403 gets into the mechanics of clean water projects, how the council and clean water service provider will coordinate in identifying, prioritizing, and selecting projects. And we've also addressed the requirements for permitting, operation and maintenance, and site control. Finally, the subchapter 4 ends in addressing the potential that a project may not be effective. It may be damaged. It may not function as it was intended. It may be completely lost. So we tried to evaluate those potential scenarios and how a project might be rehabilitated and what funds would be available to do so. Subchapter 5 gives some structure for basin water quality councils, including per the statute, the members of that body, as well as responsibilities and meetings and actions. Subchapter 6, as Neil alluded to, addresses conflicts of interest, which we've spent a long time working with stakeholders trying to come up with the best approach It does tie back, and I failed to mention this in the both in the clean water service provider section as well as the project clean water project selection section. It does tie into the mechanics of how a council identifies a project that is that should be prioritized to move forward, and how that project is actually procured or assigned by a QUISP. Namely, or sort of key in the conflicts of interest section is that the clean water service provider has to have a policy that has a clear definition of conflict of interest, and that requires both a clean water service provider decision maker as well as a council member decision maker to identify, disclose any potential conflicts and recuse from a decision that might be subject to that conflict. And as I mentioned, going through the clean water service provider subchapter, the rule ends in terms of reviewing the progress of a clean water service provider, providing potential for a corrective action plan, and also addressing the renewal and removal of an assignment of a clean water service provider. And I will pause there and see if we have any additions from Neil or Chris, anything that you wanted to flag in that structure, and then also any questions from the committee at this point.
I do not have anything to add, Caitlin. I am hearing a little bit of feedback, and I'm wondering whether maybe just to introduce Chris Rotler. And Chris, is there anything that you would like to add to the Caitlin summary?
Not at this time, but I'm here to support any questions the committee may have.
Right. Okay, with that.
We have a question from Representative Higley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but again, one of the concerns that I had in reading through what Ledge Council had put out there in regards to looks like the removal of all farming from eligibility. I had reached out to Senator Starr and then to Michael O'Grady in regards to having someone here today from the Ag Agency, and I don't see Ryan Patch here. Is there someone else here representing the agency, or are we going to hear from them at least?
Representative Higley, I've been in touch with the Ag Agency and have had discussed the responses that we provided with them. And I'm happy to walk through those responses with you. I'm not sure that they are participating today.
Okay, and again, Mr. Chair, I don't know if this is the time, but I would certainly like to hear what that conversation resulted in. Thank you.
May I, Senator Bray?
Thanks. And again, just as Representative Higley was saying, I'm not sure this is the time, but just to flag them in passing before we go on to other witnesses. I did have some questions around just the ag provision that was just cited. Ledge Council flagged the difference between statutory language and the rule. And I'm wondering from a legal standpoint, when they vary, and given my understanding that statute controls, I'd just like to understand the relationship between the difference in the way the language describes and expresses that. I have a few other questions, so I'll just say them. I'll just flag things, and then I know we'll come back to them later. I have a question about rulemaking as it pertains to the CWSPs. If another rulemaking is required in order to do a reassignment or a termination, I wasn't really sure how that worked. There is a note about that Ms. Ellerman cited about a definition of fiscal agent. So I don't know if that's a definition that needs to be added to the rule, just for the sake of clarity. There is a report to the legislature cited in a number of places, and I'm not really sure what the legal status of that. It seems as though some of the rulemaking hinges on that report, but I'm not sure to what degree a report to the legislature can actually be directive of the rulemaking if it varies from the underlying statute. So I'd like to circle back to that. And I think those are there's some other details in Ledge Council's longer memo, but for now, I just wanted to flag a few things in passing, and then I know that we'll either come back to them this morning or maybe there's additional follow-up. I'm not sure where we're headed quite yet. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, there's a set of questions that Ledge Council presented to DEC, and I'd like to hear more explanation about that. But I think in terms of process here, if it's okay with the committee, let's hear from the rest of the witnesses and their testimony, and then circle back to these questions and some of the other questions that, for instance, that you have, Senator Bray and Representative Higley. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah.
Senator Bray?
Yeah, and the other thing, although it's a little unusual, we have a emeritus member of LCAR who's also the chair of the House Committee of Jurisdiction, and I'm hoping that maybe that Representative that Representative Sheldon can join in the discussion today as well.
If there's no objection from the committee, I'm fine with that. Welcome, Representative Sheldon.
Thank you for that. I am here and listening intently.
Okay.
Emerita. I should have said Emerita. Sorry.
Okay, if it's okay with everyone, let's proceed to the next witness on the list, Holden Sparacino. Do I have that correctly?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, committee members, and thanks for the opportunity to testify before LCAR on the Clean Water Service Provider Rule. My name is Holden Sparacino. I'm the Water Quality Programs Manager for the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, which assists and supports Vermont's 14 conservation districts in their work to engage with communities and conserve, maintain, use, and improve natural resources in Vermont. As Neil said, we have been engaged with DEC for over a year in the development of this rule. And I really appreciate DEC's efforts to engage with environmental organizations across the state, large and small, recognizing that this is a substantial change in the way that clean water projects will be developed, designed, and implemented in the state of Vermont going forward. We do support the department's proposed modified language that Neil presented to you this morning and very recently around the procurement process. DEC proposed this modification after hearing from numerous stakeholder groups, including us, that the rule language functionally modified how clean water projects would be carried out, and in a manner that didn't allow for the proposed change to be open to public comment. The recently proposed modification, however, effectively restores the rule to a version that was reviewed and approved by both stakeholder groups and through the public comment period, so we do support that modification. In addition, I wanted to illustrate how this modification might change projects on the ground. We believe that without this modification, the rule does not account for the fact that these are voluntary projects with landowners who may have built working relationships with unique organizations. We believe that this modification allows projects to account for the substantial time in the development of these applications, including meeting with landowners, engineers, creating budgets, and assessing natural resources concerns through the procurement process. And also this modification would allow for more complex projects. Many times we see projects brought to DEC that have substantial external match, sometimes 2 to 3 times the cost for the state to implement the work. And this procurement change would allow for those more complex projects to be considered and bring that external match to the table. So those are my illustrative examples of the way that this slight modification would help projects on the ground be implemented, and especially complex projects that leverage multiple funders, projects developed from local small environmental organizations, and or projects that include voluntary measures where communities or landowners are trying to go above and beyond what is required by the state to improve water quality in the state of Vermont. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'm not seeing any questions. Thank you, Holden. Next up is Bonnie Weniger, Executive Director of Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission.
Good morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to testify this morning and hearing about our support and concerns for the Clean Water Service Provider Rule. The CVRPC this morning, I'm representing the regional planning commissions that are proposed as clean water service providers under the rule. Several of our executive directors participated in the rule, not the rule, my apologies. Yes, in the rules development as part of the advisory committee. And then those of us that are proposed as QUIS also participated once those proposals were there to better understand the agency's thinking, but also the thinking of our partners engaged in the rule. We do appreciate the opportunity to serve as a QUIS. Generally, the change proposed by the agency is something we support. We support more than 90% of the rule. We do remain concerned that the inherent conflicts created by the statute and the makeup of the Basin Water Quality Council and the rules attempt to address the context may inhibit volunteer groups from applying to implement projects. As Holden mentioned, most of the groups out there implementing projects are volunteer-based, and that link to the landowner, link to the project development piece is very critical. But at this time, we are supporting the rule as it is with the hopes that our concerns will prove unwarranted as we move forward in implementing it. We're at an early stage here. We know all the details aren't worked out. If that's not the case, we might be back requesting small tweaks in the future to the rule, just to ensure that we actually get good projects on the ground. I think everyone's goal here is improving and bringing about more cleaner water in Vermont and seeing those changes happen over time. And that's it. I'll be short today. Thank you.
Any questions for Bonnie? Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Seeing none, we'll move on to Karen Freeman, Director of Conservation Programs, VHCB.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Representative Squirrel and other committee members. Yes, I am Karen Freeman, and I'm the Conservation Director at the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And on behalf of the board, I want to thank the Department of Environmental Conservation staff for the extensive stakeholder engagement involved in the Clean Water Service Provider rulemaking over the past 2 years. I also really appreciate the committee's review of the rule, your feedback, as well as today's participatory process. VHCB, as the designated clean water service provider for the Memphremagog Basin, has been involved in the robust discussion about the many facets of the draft Clean Water Service Provider Rule. Designing a new delivery system for non-regulatory clean water projects is complex, and ensuring that public investments to meet phosphorus reduction goals are carried out in an efficient and effective manner is a balancing act. One of the topics of continuing and recent discussions amongst the stakeholder advisory group has been around conflict of interest, as has been alluded to previously. And while it is vital that the rules safeguard the system from these potential conflicts, the rule also needs to allow for a delivery system that can function well. VHCB feels this balance is achieved by the rule, including the language recommended by the department to be inserted in the procurement services goods section as was presented today. Authorization of the rule for final adoption will be a real milestone, and in consort with sufficient funding for clean water service providers to administer this innovative delivery system, which we expect will be provided soon. VHCB is pleased to be joining others in being all in for helping achieve clean water goals in the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Any questions for Karen? Okay, not seeing any. Next up is Mary Russ, Executive Director, White River Partnership.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the committee, for this opportunity to testify. My name is Mary Russ. I'm Executive Director of the White River Partnership, a watershed group in East Central Vermont, and Board Chair of Watersheds United Vermont, an association of Vermont's community-based watershed groups. Both organizations I'm representing today have been active members of DEC's Advisory Committee on Act 76 for the past 2 years. And we also applaud DEC for their efforts to incorporate into the final rule stakeholder suggestions related to a variety of topics and concerns. I want to keep my comments brief because they echo what you've heard from some of the other witnesses today. In short, we do not support the final rule as submitted. Instead, we support the final rule with DEC's modification to the procurement section, which Neil shared earlier. Here's why. As you've heard today, DEC removed a phrase in the procurement section of the rule after public comment. This edit fundamentally changed how clean water projects are selected and implemented by separating projects from implementing organizations. In our opinion, this seemingly minor edit represents a significant change that was not subject to the public comment process. In addition to this procedural issue, we believe there are a number of substantive issues with the final rule procurement section language. A couple have been mentioned before, so I won't repeat them, but a few to consider include the language initiates a second review process outside of the Basin Water Quality Council led process mandated by Act 76, and it gives clean water service providers unilateral authority to procure project implementers, including themselves, without corresponding conflict of interest rules. When we learned about the procurement section edit in the final rule, we communicated about our concerns to DEC, concerns that, as you've heard today, were shared by other members of the advisory committee. In response, we're really pleased that DEC proposed to modify the procurement section language, again, which Neil shared earlier. We like the proposed modification for 2 reasons. In addition to restoring language included in the draft rule, which was subject to a rigorous public comment process, the proposed modification addresses all of the substantive issues that have been outlined. Before I go, I want to mention quickly the relationship between this rule and the forthcoming guidance. Act 76 mandates that the rule work in tandem with guidance to create this new clean water funding system that enhances regional coordination to effectively implement clean water and pollution reduction projects. We believe that without Neil's recommended changes, the final rule as submitted would make it impossible to develop guidance that enhances regional coordination to effectively implement pollution reduction projects. So in closing, we support the final rule with DEC's modification to the procurement section. We believe the final rule in combination with this proposed modification does create space for the development of guidance that can accomplish the intention and specific provisions of Act 76. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify this morning.
Any questions for Mary? Thank you, Mary. Why don't we circle back then to questions that we had, and maybe Neil, it might be useful for you to give us maybe, I don't know how to put it, a summary of your responses to the questions asked by Ledge Council, because I think that's related to some of the questions that Representative Higley and Senator Bray also had. And then we can follow on with additional questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Squirrel. So I'm happy to speak to the questions regarding how the service provider rule interacts with clean water projects in the agricultural sector. It is correct that the agency provided a little additional context in the definitions around what a clean water project is with respect to agriculture. And it is correct that the recommendations came from a legislative report issued by Secretary of Administration that synthesized the agency's interest from both Agency of Agriculture and Agency of Natural Resources to make sure that the new clean water service provider network wasn't bumping into and essentially crossing wires or crossing swim lanes, highway lanes, if you will, with the existing and highly efficient agricultural provider network. So to clarify, we do not believe that the language deviates from statutory intent. The reason for that is that clean water service providers should not be constructing projects that are required under the required agricultural practices. And the rule is clear on that. The rule does not preclude a clean water service provider from assisting a farmer in building a non-regulatory natural resource project type best management practice. However, the rule does establish a consultation with the agency that the clean water service provider would engage when doing that. And that's very specifically to avoid this overlap of the networks that provide clean water funding in the agricultural sector versus this new clean water fund supported non-regulatory project system with the service providers. There has been a little bit of question about sub-jurisdictional farms. And so there are farms that fly below the threshold of the required agricultural practices. Any projects that a service provider would elect to build on those are fair game. Ledge Counsel O'Grady did ask whether those projects should be subject to Agency of Agriculture review. Agency of Natural Resources contends that these do not need to be subject to review by the Agency of Agriculture when they're on non-RAP. We can clarify that in guidance. We also can propose language to be inserted in the rule that will clarify that matter. There was one other question with respect to agriculture that I will touch on. And I'm just going to go through my notes to where that is here. And it has to do with why the consultation is in there in the first place. And as I noted, it is to make sure that we don't have wires crossed in terms of the different networks providing funding. Typically in the agricultural sector, the big players are Natural Resources Conservation Service, Agency of Agriculture, RAP and BAP funding programs, and additional programs that the Agency of Ag wields. It's long been Agency of Natural Resources policy position that when agriculture project funding requests come to DEC for clean water funds, that they will have first been through Agency of Agriculture and Natural Resources Conservation Service. So when DEC provides clean water funding into an agricultural project, it is to complement what's not fundable from those other organizations. And that's why I feel strongly that the consultation is a helpful step to make sure that there isn't, for example, overinvestment or investment of clean water fund through the formula grants when that investment could have been captured by the BMP program or the RAP program or NRCS. So in short, we do believe that the language hews to statutory intent. It does not limit the ability of a QUISP to build a clean water natural resources project on agricultural land. It certainly doesn't limit the ability of a QUISP to create an innovative project as well. It does speak to the engagement with Agency of Ag in order to make sure that we're not crossing wires. And there is specific language in the rule that directs that in guidance, we structure how that consultation takes place. I think I have covered those pieces. I just want to check my notes on Senator Bray's questions. Yes, Senator Bray, the legislative report So Act 76 also compelled a legislative report on water quality, clean water projects, funding on farms, and had 4 specific statutory charges. The rule looked at the responses to 2 of those charges and implemented those. We do not contend that a legislative report constitutes statute. However, we don't believe that the system that we've proposed is in conflict with the statutory intent. So allow me to stop there, Representative Squirrel, and see if there's any additional follow-up on these points.
Sorry, I was muted. Senator Lyons. You're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. I do have a couple of questions. I think perhaps we'll hear counsel from O'Grady, so I'll sort of hold off on that, but I am concerned about the report as I read through that response about the legislative report and the authority that's been given that report. That's a concern. So I think going back and talking about the role of the Agency of Agriculture will be important for us going forward. I do have a question about on pages 8 and 9 of the list of changes in the final proposed rule, the table that you put together, which I think is really quite helpful. But looking at page 8 in the top part of the table where it talks about local watershed protection organization allowing anyone to be a member, which I think is consistent with those organizations. And then, but then the conflict of interest piece where these groups will be involved in decision making, I would think. So I'm trying to figure out the relationship between the local watershed protection organizations and any conflict of interest in decision making with the CWSPs, and how that will work. And then if you look on page where I'm looking is on page 9, and then on page 9 in the second box of the table on the subchapter 6, a person engaged in a CWSP decision-making must disclose any potential conflict and then shall recuse itself. And I'm wondering if that should be him or herself. So there are two questions really about how the conflict of interest, the relationship between the local watershed protection organizations and the CWSPs, and then the recusal and who or what is recusing under subchapter 6, little c. That's it for now.
Representative Squirrel, should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Senator Lyons. It's nice to see you. The local watershed protection.
Good to see you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. The local watershed protection organizations have 2 seats on the Basin Water Quality Council. So they are indeed decision makers. And we worked in concert with Watersheds United Vermont and other stakeholders to craft a definition around what constitutes a local watershed protection organization, so as to make sure that the correct skills and knowledge were at the table making the decision on the public investment. And so those watershed associations, I'll term them, are decision makers just as are the other statutory seated members, the members of the districts, the members of the regional planning commissions, the members of municipalities, and a member of a land conservation organization. So they're subject to the same conflict of interest provision as any others. Essentially, if there's a material matter of which they would be making a decision that materially benefits them, that they would recuse, identify that conflict and recuse, just the same as any other seated member. Does that help with that question? Okay.
Yes, it does. Yep.
Great, thank you. The second was actually in the second to last box, the clean water service provider conflict in and of itself. In the initial public review version of the rule, we had been focused on sort of the prospect of conflict amongst members of the council and their decision-making with respect to the assignment of a project and the attachment of funds to that project. We realized through reviewing our public comments that we hadn't subjected this clean water service provider to the same provision, which makes perfect sense. And so the context here is more in the context of an individual working within a clean water service provider who may award a contract, for example, to their brother. That would constitute a conflict of interest. And so we wanted to make sure that was clear as well. And the terminology itself is, reflective of the service provider as an organization. We can certainly substitute themselves, for example, if it makes more sense.
Yeah, I'm wondering if him or herself makes more sense there rather than excluding the entire organization if there's one individual member who has a conflict. I mean, if everybody has a conflict, then that's a done deal, but I think identifying individual conflict is what is, I think that's what you mean there, but you can clarify.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in, Senator Lyons. I appreciate your noticing this. I think it might be actually grammatical correction that we could make, that themselves might be appropriate in this case, and themselves as an alternative to himself or herself. We're trying to be mindful of just avoiding gender terms as well. So I believe, and we can certainly reflect on it or take other input, but we were speaking to the person who would have a conflict, and I think themselves might be the appropriate term for that.
Okay, but then you'd have to say persons engaged. So, you guys will let others be I'll let others be the grammarians, but it would seem that.
Thank you.
Thank you. That helped. That's very helpful. I was very concerned about that when I read it. Thanks.
Representative Squirrel, there were two other pieces in Senator Bray's list. Would you like me to speak to those, or shall we stay on the agriculture?
Well, Representative Higley had his hand up, so let me have him ask his question, and you can go back to Senator Bray's question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate you going over the ag piece. It sounds like there still could be collaboration with ag as long as RAPs and BMPs and so on, different monies there are exhausted. You would also mention maybe some wording clarification in projects that of ag that don't necessarily meet RAPs. Is that what the ag agency as well has suggested, is maybe additional wording that would clarify some of what you've just said?
Yes, in fact, we do have some draft language we could propose that does that. Essentially, there's a section in the rule at 39304B that it's the section that establishes the guidance, and it directs us as an agency to develop guidance that in part says how, for projects in the agriculture sector, the service provider shall consult with the agency of ag to determine eligibility. And so what we would do is propose to add language to that would say, for projects in the agriculture sector proposed on farms subject to the RAP rule, consult with agency of agriculture on project eligibility. And so that would clarify and narrow the window of where that consultation happens, which both agencies feel is a valuable step to make sure the best funding source is used for the project. And then there's a second piece in the rule as well. There are two places where that identical language could be added. So just to provide that clarity.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure, sir. And I have consulted with Ryan Patch on this.
Neil, would you like to proceed with your question, answers to Senator Bray's questions?
Sure. Senator Bray, I have on your list questions about reassignment, and I have questions about the definition for fiscal agent. So Ledge Counsel O'Grady and Dexter Cooper did.
Sure. Sorry to interrupt. Before we go on to those, could we stay on the one we're on just a little, just for the sake of continuity of discussion. So consultation with the Agency of Agriculture, it's seems a little fuzzy to me what we mean by that. Do they have the chance to, thumbs up, thumbs down on a project? Is it approval or just notification, really?
Well, we view it as approval in terms of determining the eligibility. And the reason is that it's the Agency of Agriculture who's going to know when something on a farm is required under the RAPs versus not. Excuse me, the lawnmowers are coming at the school next door. The Agency of Ag is going to be the agency that's aware of where a particular farm is at with respect to RAP compliance. And because it's not necessarily cut and dry, it's not necessarily for the service provider to know that per se. So if let's say a farmer approaches the service provider and says, I want to build a, XYZ 123, I'm not sure what the project would be, a constructed treatment wetland or something like that. Well, that may be something that's been required by the agriculture agency. The service provider may not be aware of it and may actually fund something that's regulatory when really we would rather that go through the proper regulatory channels. And so that's the example that we're trying to guard against. Now, Act 76 does have a provision that requires the agencies to participate in the Basin Water Quality Council's proceedings. And so the Act and the General Assembly has already directed that we all be at the table. And so as a result, I personally am not worried about the consultation step because I do feel it's a healthy step to make sure that the most appropriate funds are being used for the most appropriate projects.
Sure.
And of course, may I offer one other, which is if the service provider is seeking to support a project on a farm, an Agency of Agriculture indicates that that is not a supportable project because it's a regulatory project, then by definition, that project should go right back into Agency of Agriculture's funding queue. And so because we interact on a regular basis around the funding lanes on the funding highway, I think that's a healthy step as well.
Sure. And, let me just pause and say, I appreciate, my questions aren't criticism, they're just questions, but we all spent a couple of months on this in the Senate and then went over to the House. So I know there's a lot of deep interest in both committees and seeing it roll out. And I also just wanted to compliment the agency on its very extensive, outreach on the way to today. Your comments and responses were very helpful. All right, so you had mentioned the possibility of language to further clarify what happens between the agencies. I don't know if that's something you've already drafted, and not to be, and to put my cards completely on the table. I'm sensing that there are enough questions that at some point I would propose to the acting chair and chair postpone of action to a next meeting in order to be able to get any kind of language that's proposed to be added to the rule, amended, et cetera, into a single document so that we can see all those, because by my count, we're now maybe up to 3 edits, something like that. And would just, from bill development work, it's always great to get everything on the table at once, as opposed to sort of having sticky notes sticking out of the corner saying, before final, change this, et cetera. So I'll just pause there. So anyway, I don't know if you have language around what consultation, what those roles and responsibilities are, what the authority is of the agency when it consults, can it, for instance, reject a project? That kind of thing.
Caitlin, do you have a response?
Thank you. Yes, Senator Bray, I agree with that approach. In anticipating the meeting over the last couple of days and reviewing questions and preparing responses, it appeared that we had a method of resolving most of them, but that there would be changes. I'm happy that we're having really productive discussions so that we're able to address some of those directly, by discussing, but I think it does make sense to prepare a proposed package to sort of sign off on, as opposed to the sticky note approach that might not be concrete enough at this point. With regard to the consultation piece, we did draft some concrete language that's very simple. If you search the rule, you will find the consultation piece in two locations. The first is the reference in section 306. Let's see, it might be 304.
304B.
304B related to the Secretary's guidance. So we did incorporate a reference to the consultation that our guidance would give more detail on how that would work. And we refer to how, for projects in the agriculture sector, the QUISP shall consult with ag. We would, to clarify on the question that's been received, and now we have confirmed with ag that we would narrow that for projects in the agriculture sector, and then insert proposed on farms subject to the required agricultural practices rule, the QUISP shall consult. So narrowing it there, there's that insertion. And then again, in the technical implementation project, clean water project section, 39-403D3, we again make that reference in sort of the sequence of events for projects in the agriculture sector proposed on farms subject to the RAP rule only. Consult with ag to determine whether such a project qualifies as a clean water project. So clarifying, they do have the ability to make that determination, but it's only on a RAP farm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Representative Shelton.
Thank you, Chair Squirrel. I also want to just follow up on Senator Bray's acknowledgement of all the hard work that's gone into this rule and how we are into the weeds on it. But overall, it's a really remarkable work, and I appreciate all the effort that's gone into it. Can you help me, probably it's going to be Neil, understand the relationship between or how the 10% load allocation is relevant and how it relates to whether a clean water project is required or not required? I don't understand that. So if you could help me, that'd be great.
That's fine, Representative Sheldon. Good morning and nice to see you as well. So the manner in which the clean water improvements are implemented and taken stock of relative to the TMDL is within different allocations of the TMDL. So there is a requirement to reduce non-point source from agriculture, from forestry, from stream banks, from sub-jurisdictional developed lands. And then there's a requirement to reduce regulatory, with regulatory mechanisms, pollution from the developed land sector and other sectors. And so the 10% load allocation is essentially an agreement between the agencies that was assembled to provide to you that legislative report that just sort of sets the sideboards for how much each agency should, quote unquote, go after in terms of nutrient reduction in the agriculture sector. And there's a lot of reduction there. And so that 10%, 10% of a lot is still a lot to be getting on with. So essentially what that does is it just creates a swim lane, if you will, within which the clean water service providers are being assigned a reduction of nutrient within that sector. Recall that the Act sets forth a mechanism where the agency assigns nutrient reduction targets and allows the service provider to go after those reduction targets and provides a sufficient amount of money to pay for those annual targets. So the idea would be that the service provider would be looking at only 10% of the load allocation for the agricultural sector when they're doing that work. That allows them to keep a majority of the body of the funds available to support other sectors that also need nutrient reduction. So sub-jurisdictional stormwater, private roads, forestry, river corridor, equilibrium, floodplain restoration, and the like, buffers. So that is where the allocation, 10% of the allocation comes from. And then in terms of the Agency of Agriculture's consultation role, that's not necessarily about that at all. That's rather, as I noted to Senator Bray, a means to make sure that the right funding is being used for the project.
Thank you. I guess my concern is that by limiting it to 10%, we may be losing out on opportunities that are more cost effective in the natural resource conservation realm that are not regulatorily required.
That's a good point. And I guess what I would offer is sort of when you're thinking about natural resources restoration, for example, I'll use an example you know well, floodplain restoration project that may occur on agricultural land. So that is clearly a natural resources project. So it is clearly in the bailiwick of a service provider to fund. Consult with Agency of Agriculture, they would be fine with that project. That project may address some of the agricultural load allocation, would also address another part of the allocation, So stream equilibrium has its own allocation swim lane, if you will, within the TMDL. So when the agency was quote unquote booking nutrient reduction for that project, we would be looking at which allocations that project is actually pinging against. And in nearly all the cases that I can imagine, the natural resource restoration projects are going to affect not simply the agriculture allocation.
So in your example, would the Agency of Agriculture then be more responsible for funding that floodplain restoration project?
If that floodplain restoration project were required under the RAPS in order to address an issue on the farm, then that would be under their jurisdiction. Typically, like a floodplain restoration where you're buying an easement and asking a producer to step away and doing it in a non-regulatory manner is not a requirement under the RAPs. There are agricultural programs, however, that do pay for that. Correct. So the point being that, again, getting back to this, what's the best funding source for the project?
Right. So I guess I still have the concern that you're limiting the dollars available for those types of projects. And so the 10% actually limits the dollars going towards certain project types. And then also, and I'm hearing it's also the accounting on the other end for getting credit for reducing the phosphorus.
I will say that the 10% is part of the legislative report. The 10% doesn't show up in this rule.
Yeah.
And so we're not providing an interpretation in this rule on the 10%. As we build formula grants, we may move to do that. If it becomes limiting, it is certainly something that can be revisited. But again, it's the Secretary of Administration's report to you all, and we're within the rule implementing pieces of that, and operationally would implement other pieces of that.
Yeah, which also gets to the concern of the relationship of the report to the rule. But so thank you.
Other questions? Senator Lyons?
Actually, Representative Sheldon asked the main question that I had, but I have just kind of an overview type question, and that is, as we're looking at these projects, and some of them are other, I guess we'd call them other projects. Some are those we would expect, and then there are other projects that might come forward. But overall, is there going to be attention given to the permanence of the effect? So in other words, once a project is done, are we thinking that we are going to have continued reinvestment in the same area, or are we going to see some long-term changes? So will buffers, for example, thinking of buffers as being something more permanent and cleanup, and then there might be some other projects that are shorter term, but how is the agency within the rules looking at the permanence of these projects?
Thank you, Senator Lyons. That's a good question. And so the section, the chapter on technical considerations in the rule establishes the agency shall develop sort of design life expectations for all project types. Not all projects are permanent, obviously. Some get better over time. Floodplain restorations, river corridor easements, buffers, the effect of nutrient reduction gets stronger over time. Some rain gardens, sub-jurisdictional stormwater, without proper operation and maintenance may diminish over time. And so the Act does two things about this. It firstly prioritizes funding for the operation and maintenance of practices that have been built by the service providers and funds that. And so that's really good. And secondarily, it requires the agency to develop design life expectations and accounting methodologies that take stock of the fact that a project may have diminishing returns after 10 years or 15 years. If you're a student of the Clean Water Performance Report, which is issued on an annual basis, it's a very big, robust report, but in there are actually really good expressions of that. You see the investment and you see the nutrient reduction and you see the projected nutrient reduction perpetuating in time, presuming that those projects are operated and maintained. And when we find out a project isn't, we actually zero out that nutrient benefit. And so this exact same mechanism is within this rule and will be within the system.
Thank you, Dale. Any other questions? Senator McDonald.
I've been trying to follow the money in this rule, and I feel like I'm following. I'm looking at the dilemmas we wrestle with in healthcare, where we argue or are concerned with the money we spend for hospitalizations and heart transplants and correcting for misbehavior of our lifestyles. And I was trying to focus on the money, looking at the formula grant and how the formula makes a decision on where the money goes. And it seems like there's a lot of build, 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 and little prevent. And it seems to leave quite a bit of discretion for how things will be scored. I had like 4 places where on page 7, the establishment of a formula grant program. Page 8 dealt with co-benefits of projects. Page 14 shall establish the methodology for awarding or scoring grants. And then on page 17, it gives the secretary the authority to make adjustments to the things that have already been established. And meanwhile, we to take a specific example, and I apologize, Mr. Chair, for kind of doing a higher level look at this. When we get to the agriculture section and we talk about how we can protect water quality by not seeking to make water rush downhill as fast as possible, but slowing it down and allowing the earth and the soil to process water. Today, we still do not regulate the practice of going to farms and draining wetlands and making water run downhill quickly. We don't do that. People buy land and then they go in and ditch and they put in underground ditches and they dispense water quickly downhill. So who's going to make the decisions on this? The secretary of the administration or the regional groups that discuss how funding will be allotted under this plan? With whom does the power to make a decision go or no go for applications under these rules? Who makes the decisions?
Thank you, Senator McDonald. So Act 76 specifically vests the Basin Water Quality Council with the authority to set policy and make decisions regarding the most important impairments and the projects that will address those impairments. So when a clean water service provider is working with its council to identify the nutrient reduction value of a project and look at those co-benefits, the ultimate decision to advance that project is one that's a local decision made by the local Basin Water Quality Council. And then the project moves forward. I'd like to also—
the administration doesn't look at their recommendations and say, notwithstanding your recommendation, we believe you should do something alternative?
So the department and the agency actually has a different role, which is to make sure that the project is actually an eligible project. So there is a provision in the rule that the agency needs to see the projects and ensure that they're eligible for formula grant funding. And so if a project is eligible for formula grant funding, so it's the right kind of project, it's non-regulatory, then we leave it to the local decision-making where the knowledge rests. That's the intent of this act, is to rely on local expertise and local knowledge to identify the best projects that both achieve the nutrient reduction goal, because that's what the service provider is being paid to do, but also achieve local co-benefits of value to the local communities as well. And so that's why the decision-making rests with the local organizations. I will say also that there's a built-in incentive to make sure that there's not an overinvestment in co-benefits relative to nutrient reduction, because the formula grants are built on the standard cost for a project and the expectation of how many projects of XYZ type will be accomplished in a given year. And so that's there's an incentive built into the system to make sure that the nutrient reduction is realized. That said, if there's a project of high local value that may have a lesser nutrient reduction, the Basin Council and QUISP can elect to construct that project and then construct a more efficient one in another location. So that is the way the act was envisioned and the way the rule is constructed to implement it. I would like to also address the prevent, which is a very good point. And so Act 76 in the back end, one of the session law sections, one of the regular sections, amends the manner of the Clean Water Board's activities to prioritize investment into an enhancement and protection grant program specifically to prevent water bodies from becoming impaired. And so that is no more than 25% of the annual fund balance, not to exceed $5 million on an annual basis. So that investment is not necessarily through the service providers, but that is a mechanism that the General Assembly has adopted to make sure that there are funds going into prevention as well.
So when you look at prevent, which is if money goes where the priorities are the highest, the tendency is for them to go to reduce taxes in municipalities that have big sewer systems. That's where the priorities many regions would consider the highest. And if you're dealing with preventing, and the preventing comes in a close second to the alternative, which is the correct, how do you deal with when it comes to climate change and carbon sequestration, when the same practice would both clean water and sequester carbon, and in both cases, which are separate sort of jurisdictions, they both come in a close second. They're not the ones that get the money. They came in second. I ran for office in the House several times and always came in second in a 2-member district, or in all the towns, and then ended up being a high vote getter. So how do we address that sort of notion that if prevention comes in second all the time, and it gets beat by municipalities that wish to build and construct and make up for lack of prevention, how do these rules solve that dilemma? And I don't expect an answer, and that's what I worry about, because that's the same problem that Senator Lyons and her committee deals with in healthcare, which is they scratch their heads and go, we're spending more and more and more on trying to correct the flaws that people had and not keep them healthier with less money. So, thank you.
Charlene, what was the time that we had set for this meeting today? Is it till 10:30 or till 11? I just want to be cognizant of that.
It's until 11.
Okay, great, thanks. Are there any other questions? I have a question. I'll get back to you, Senator Bray. For Michael O'Grady, based on the responses from Department of Environmental Conservation of your 12 questions and what you've heard today in testimony, does that raise additional questions to you and your understanding of this issue?
It doesn't raise additional questions for me. I think the agency's responses for most of the questions were responsive. Then it's up to you to whether or not they're acceptable. I do think you likely should understand the scope of the agriculture provision when you read the report that was submitted as a recommendation. The Agency of Agriculture says that both RAPs, the rules, and BMPs are requirements of 6 VSA Chapter 215. So does that mean a voluntary BMP that doesn't require Agency of Agriculture financing still would be ineligible for a clean water service provider grant? That is, I think, a question that I haven't heard anyone address. I have floated that concept to the agency. Is a voluntary BMP, so it's not subject to the RAPs, it's not required by the agency, and the farmer is not seeking agency funding, so it's not subject to the BMP financing rule. Is that voluntary BMP eligible to be funded by a clean water service provider?
Neil?
Thank you, Legislative Council. I appreciate that. I did not speak to that specific piece when I was making my remarks and answering to Senator Bray's questions. Our interpretation is that a farmer seeking funding from a service provider to construct a natural resource related BMP project is eligible for service provider funding. If that is a voluntary project that is not required in order to comply with the RAPs, so that's our interpretation. So we do not believe that that is ineligible, but we do believe that the consultation is a valuable step to make sure that the right funding stream is being used for that project. I apologize, I didn't hit that one square on earlier.
And I think probably consultation is going to be needed for those types of projects because USDA lists things like forested buffers as an equip eligible fund. So a farmer could go through the agency and under the BMP rule, or it could go through the clean water service provider. It's probably whether or not the farmer wants to subject themselves to the NRCS criteria or where they're going to get the most funds.
Thank you for that. And that's very, very much exactly what we're concerned about, is that it may be slightly easier to go through the state pathway as opposed to the federal, but the federal dollars are there. And if we can tap into them, firstly, that is the best thing we can do to preserve the state's investment.
That was the only point of clarification I was looking for.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Neil. Any other questions? Senator Bray.
I feel like I have a lot of questions today. So I don't know that we need to get to an answer now, but again, with the notion of making the meeting productive by making sure we have them on the table and can address them before reconvening again. I'm wondering about, so I'll just list three and then I can say a little more about each. One was compensation. The second one is the role of rulemaking going forward related to CWSPs. And the other is the role of guidance. So on the compensation side, there's a fair amount of back and forth about, for instance, on the basin committee membership, what's that the members are duly compensated. And where does that money come from? And there's discussion about different funding streams to fund different portions of the basin committee. So I know that one of the things that was a kind of a touchstone for the committee over and over again was to try to control costs. And I'm sure that's a shared concern. And that we not have the administrative overhead grow to beyond 15%. Can you say something about to what degree that cap includes every funding stream that goes out to support this work, so that we don't end up with 15% of a grant being allowed for administrative overhead, but then yet from a separate funding stream goes to pay compensation. So in effect, you might have as a total cost fees in excess of 15%. Or did you treat that 15% as comprehensive, regardless of the source of the funds? The total to grantees and sub-grantees would never exceed 15% in total.
Thank you, Senator Bray. So with respect to that, we interpret the act to impose the 15% cap on administrative costs on the formula grants, on the enhancement protection grants, on the municipal stormwater grants, and on the private stormwater grants. The act also very specifically notes that the performance grants authorized under 1253D, 10-C 1253D, shall pay for the participation in the Basin Council for the statutory members of 1253D. So those are 6 seats, 2 RPC, 2 Conservation District, 2 Watershed Association. The agency will put those, and are actively, literally working on building those grant agreements right now, will put those costs for participation for those members in the basin planning performance grants. there is not statutory language limiting the administrative. And in fact, the purpose of those performance grants includes a variety of tasks necessary to meaningfully engage those groups in the process of basin planning. The elegance of what Act 76 did was to make sure that that process is married to the Basin Water Quality Council decision-making. So that's good. And we do not feel that those 6 seats belong in the administrative costs of the formula grant. They're separate. And then there are 3 remaining seats, 2 municipalities and 1 land conservation organization. Because statute is silent on where their home is in terms of their they're within the administration. Service provider will cover the cost of those remaining 6 seats. They're independently funded.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm the only one who had this issue in the last 20 seconds. When you got to the +3 seats, Neil, then a fair amount of your voice disappeared.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. 3 seats are covered under the administrative costs of the formula award. 6 seats are statutorily directed to the basin planning performance grants under a different section of statute. And so that is one means of controlling the demand on the administrative cost of the formula grant. As Mr. Rotler on the line and I can tell you, we both share a concern that we want to make sure this operation works. And so to minimize external demands on that 15%, to allow the 15% to support the service provider to administer the program is very important to us. So we're not.
There was a comment about, might this lead to a different level of compensation for the 3 members versus the 6? I'm guessing that, I'm not sure if you've addressed that or not.
It is not, the statute doesn't require that to be in the rule. Those are provisions that would be in the grant agreements, but we are considering sort of a stipend-based approach. We haven't completely sorted that out yet, and that's kind of a matter of the grant making itself.
Okay.
And I will say, Senator, that our stakeholders are interested in this and made sure that we included language in the rule to allow reasonable compensation for participation in the Basin Council.
And I don't know that this is necessarily part of the rule or not, but just because legislators are often asked about our way of remunerating people who participate in all sorts of panels. I think it's a $50 a day, which I think everyone knows is a questionable level of compensation to get people working at the level that we often ask them to work at. Is this not going to be guided by that sort of standard meeting stipend? You'll develop a different sort of compensation approach?
Yeah, and it is very much a matter of negotiating the scopes of work for the grants, the performance grants, and thing that we're engaged in with the partners right now. It's not part of the rule nor part of this proceeding, but just to be clear, in the same way this rule was a dialogue, the development of the scopes are a dialogue, and we work back and forth with the stakeholders that receive those awards to understand what their proposed scope of work is, and then to fund each of those buckets of work appropriately.
Thank you.
You had asked about the rulemaking going forward, sir. Do you want me to?
Yes. Yes, please.
Sure. So there's 4 provisions around, interim service and reassignment and things of that nature. The department's perspective, the agency's perspective, is that rulemaking is required when we are going to assign to a new clean water service provider for a term of service. So if we have a service provider who was unable to achieve the work for whatever purpose, and perhaps there was an interim period where a backup service provider stepped in and provided interim service, and it was determined that we need to develop by RFP, solicit a new service provider. We would do that RFP process as articulated in the rule, but then we would go through this process and have this discussion with you again to amend Appendix A of the rule and to create the new identity of the service provider. So if the, let me see, I'm going to use completely fictitious names. If the New York City Regional Planning Commission is not able to cut the mustard, so to speak, and we then do an RFP and we identify the Herkimer County Conservation District as the next RPC, the next service provider, we will open the rule and subject that to the full public comment to identify and assign that new service provider. We have in the rule created a mechanism so that a service provider can provide interim or backup services in the event that another service provider is unable to if something happens. And Appendix A of the rule identifies Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission as the backup for the remainder. And that was actually a role that they applied to serve when they responded to the RFP.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. So in other words, it's technically a rulemaking because Appendix A gets amended, but it's not sort of rulemaking in the traditional sense of writing a new rule and engaging the public in that.
It would be making amendment to the rule. And,
right.
And we've worked together on, for example, the water standards and classification, right? And so of putting a new water body into the table of reclassified waters, I view it as very much like that.
Got it. Thank you. We do that for MCLs and other stuff. Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
Mr. Chair, I don't know what I see that we're coming up on 11. A couple of people have to go. I don't know if you want to have any more questions now or defer.
We have 6 members still present. We still have a little time on the clock. If you have an additional question, please feel free to ask it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you say a little more about the role of the guidance document that's yet to come? And because it seems it's going to have a major impact on how things operate, for instance, the granting of funds and stuff. So can you say what the timeline is for how that comes out? And then if people had questions about that guidance, parties, for instance, might agree or disagree with the guidance itself or have concerns, what's the process for comment? Is there a process for comment on the guidance itself to follow?
Thank you, Senator. So the guidance is a big process, and just to prep him, I may call on Mr. Rotler to provide you a little quick outline of what would be in there. Just to let you know that the rule at section 304 identifies items that should be in the guidance. The act itself is a little sort of uncommon in what it gave the agency rulemaking authority. And it also gave the agency the ability to develop guidance, which is subject to type 3 public notice. So we do have to notice the guidance, and the act actually has several provisions beyond the guidance that also are noticed under type 3. For example, the phosphorus reduction targets, the standard costs and design lines, all of that have to be noticed. The statutory deadline to develop the guidance is November of this year. We are already working hard on it. We have convened our advisory group twice, once to chat about sort of the general concepts and a second time to get into what a table of contents actually looks like. If you'd like to learn more, maybe I'll invite Chris Rotler to speak on that a little bit for you.
Sure, please. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, the guidance document has been underway in a separate track of work along with the rule development and working on the grants. The guidance document will be serving as a more in-depth, robust manual that clean water service providers and basin water quality councils can refer to when implementing and doing their participating in this process throughout the years. The guidance document roughly follows the rule outline. So we have subchapters in the rule. So we have chapters in the guidance document, including things on operations of the clean water service providers, financial operations, things like internal controls and procurement guidance, guidance for the Basin Water Quality Council rules, all the way through to replacement of the QUISPs should that be necessary if one steps down or whatever might happen. It is very much our intent that this guidance document be developed in the same participatory open process with our stakeholders. So we will continue to seek input and build this document in a collaborative way with, including the clean water service providers when they are appointed when you adopt this rule.
Great. Thanks. That's very helpful. And I figure, this is such a major paradigm shift that this is going to be a living work in progress for years to come. Maybe, coming back to amend rules, guidance documents, et cetera. So thanks. And I think that's really sort of it for questions for now. I would like to, if before we reconvene, just to be transparent about this, make an appointment to meet with you, with members of ANR, as well as Mr. O'Grady, and perhaps Representative Sheldon talked about joining me in that meeting. We could work through some finer details and just come back to the meeting and then sort of have the public expression of what those conclusions were, so that we do it all in an open meeting, but maybe get further into the weeds outside of this meeting, as well as solidify those changes to language that we were discussing making prior to the next meeting as well. So thank you.
Senator Bray, if I could sort of just read back what I believe is on the table for discussion. So in addition to the agriculture, the general discussion on the role of agriculture, the language provisions that would address sub-jurisdictional, sub-RAP farms, so the language that Caitlin had mentioned to you. The language that we brought forward in the lead off of our memo, the language that the stakeholders mentioned to you. We can certainly provide a definition of standard cost if the committee feels it's important, as well as a definition of fiscal sponsor. We can also talk about that and certainly decide whether that's necessary or not. And I think those were the items that were on the table for fine tuning.
Okay. I think that's most of it. One thing might be helpful as we are going to meet again to have, if the chair agrees, to invite someone from Agency of Agriculture in case questions. I'm not doubting your characterization of their position. I'm just saying it might be helpful to have them present in case additional questions come up around that. I know that Representative Higley's mentioned their absence today, so with an idea with the goal of being able to conclude our work next time, maybe it'd be helpful to have them come in if the committee's open to that.
Representative Squirrel, maybe when it's timely, just I could have a mark.
I think it'd be great to have someone from Ag into our next meeting as Senator Bray has recommended. Does the rest of the committee feel positive about that? Okay, great. Any other questions? Senator Bray, you want to offer us your motion?
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would move that we postpone action on Rule 20, P25, Clean Water Service Provider Rule until the next meeting of LCAR. The 45-day review end date is July 9th. So I'm not sure of our calendar in here, but I'm guessing we're meeting again prior to the 9th of July.
It's July 1st, Thursday, July 1st is our next meeting. So that'll meet that time frame. Okay, any discussion regarding the motion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
I
Okay, so-
by my microphone.
So we've postponed action on 20P25 until our next meeting, which will be July 1st. Thank you very much. Thanks, Neil and your crew and everybody else that testified.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so do I have a motion to adjourn? Senator McDonald.
So moved, but first of all, I wanted to thank you for stepping in at such short notice and bailing me out, and appreciate it. Well done.
Not a problem. We have a
Thank you for
motion to
letting-
adjourn.
I just
That
want
was-
to say.
Thank you,
for letting me
Representative
know.
Sheldon. Thank you. Motion to adjourn?
So move.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 I assume no one's opposed. Thank you. See you on July 1st.